Good afternoon and welcome to our event, Demystifying the Circular Economy, an event hosted by Donegal Local Enterprise Office as part of Local Enterprise Week 2002. I'd like to welcome you all today, both from within Donegal, but also from around the country, but also our partners on the Sensei program. And I will give you a very brief outline on our program very shortly. So those guests maybe from Greece, Italy, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. And we in Donegal are one of the partners as well. So just very briefly on Sensei, that is a European project that we have been involved in the Local Enterprise Office for the last 2 years. It was somewhat of a follow-on from a previous Interreg program we were involved in called Niche, which was around innovation in the agri-food sector. The Sensei program is around entrepreneurship in the circular economy with a particular focus on the agri-food sector or the agri-food chain. And through that program, the partners, the 9 partners from the 7 regions, we've been looking at good practices and best practice in the circular economy and sharing information and knowledge, but very importantly then developing an action plan for our respective regions or counties. Interestingly, when we started the project just over 2 years ago, in Ireland, we didn't have a national strategy. Now we have the government's circular economy strategy 2020-2023, living more and using less. So it has been a changing environment in relation to the circular economy. From our perspective in Donegal, and this probably applies in some of the other counties in Ireland, we in the Local Enterprise Office have been heavily involved in the development of the food sector since 2012. And tying in with that previous project niche around innovation, and now the circular economy has made a lot of sense for us because it brings new insights for us in the broader agri-food sector, and we think opportunities as well for our businesses in Donegal. One of the things we have identified in our action plan in Donegal in relation to the circular economy was trying to identify those entrepreneurial opportunities in relation to the circular economy. And an example might be in recent times, in very recent days, because of the conflict in Ukraine, we hear a lot of talk now about our dependency on fertilizer coming from Russia. I think 20% of our fertilizer is imported. One of the projects identified by Mabit, who developed our action plan, was the opportunity that exists in Donegal and probably in other counties in Ireland to look at maybe how we can replace that manufactured fertilizer with a biofertilizer. And I think a bit like what COVID did with the advancement of technology, perhaps, unfortunately, the conflict in Ukraine might also speed up some things like the opportunity to replace those manufactured fertilizers. One of the key things, again, as part of that project, Maura, our executive, Maura Toner, we carried out research of our partners in the 7 countries involved around the knowledge and awareness of the circular economy. And a key finding that was across the 7 countries involved was the relatively low level of awareness of and knowledge of the circular economy. It was there as a concept. I think in a lot of the regions, people knew about it, but what it actually means, how we could take it and apply it meaningfully to enterprises, how we can use it in our day-to-day life, that level of knowledge and awareness just seemed to be missing across those 7 regions. And as I say, that's Ireland, Greece, Italy, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. So, Western and Eastern Europe. So like when we looked at Local Enterprise Week, we thought, it would be a good idea perhaps to try and demystify the circular economy, look at some of the models that are out there in the circular economy, how they apply to business, and then look at some of the circular economy in practice. Again, from our experience of working with some food business in Donegal, we're seeing more of them, not a whole lot, but some more of them definitely looking at the circular economy in the context, particularly in the food and drink sector. So breweries and distilleries looking at what they can do with their waste product. Is there another added value? Can their waste become an input into somebody else's product? And yesterday we had a food event we had as part of our Enterprise Week in Donegal. We had a business presenting there who at this point in time is, carbon neutral in Donegal. So they harvest rainwater. They have their own hydro scheme on site. They make use of all of their waste into other products. So it's one of those things that, again, a lot of businesses are beginning to realize this is something not only makes sense from the point of view of the bottom line, but also can assist in their marketing of their product or their services. So today we have from Mabbott Limited. Our two guest speakers, Geraldine Boylan and Alex Fantoni, both are environmental consultants, have been working quite significantly in the circular economy over the last 5 to 10 years, and have worked probably in 60 to 80 circular economy projects in Scotland and Ireland and across Europe. So without any further ado, I'd like to now hand you over to Geraldine and Alec, who will be presenting in tandem on the topics we just outlined. So I'll hand you over now to Geraldine. Geraldine.
Hello, everybody. Greetings, and thank you very much, Michael, for that warm welcome. Hopefully, Stephen behind the scenes is able to get my colleague Alex in as well as panelist. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've got a bit of an opportunity today to take you through a number of different kind of concepts, really, and hopefully to be able to apply those concepts into some examples. It's always good to get some examples to actually work through. So without further ado, hopefully I'm screen sharing now and that is showing up. Alex, give me a thumbs up if so. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So thank you for the warm welcome again. In terms of our agenda, just in terms of kind of the hygiene, I suppose, for the meeting, I think everybody in the session is actually on mute anyway, and question and discussion points are really welcome as well. We will deal with those at the end, and Maura is kindly being our moderator today, so Maura will be collecting up any Q&A, so questions and answers posed through the session. In terms of ourselves, Michael's given us a brief introduction. I'm director for the Environment Group at Mabbott. We are an independent private consultancy. We've been doing work on environment for the last 25 years. So it's kind of not new to us. The other thing which is not new to us is the concept of taking something around sustainability and giving it a new title, to give it a new focus, but we will talk about what that means. And I'd like me to just introduce Alex. Just want to unmute and just say a quick hello to the team.
Hi everyone, I just realized my logo is the wrong side from my perspective.
It's perfect.
Fantastic. So my name is Alex Fantoni. I've been with Mabbott for 4.5 years, focusing primarily on actually food waste prevention and resource efficiency, and then working as technical lead and project manager for circular economy projects, both in the UK and across Europe, primarily in agri-food, but also manufacturing and the wider bioeconomy.
Thank you very much, Alex. We were involved in a number of European projects actually through last year. Even during lockdown, it's amazing how the opportunities can still come to share knowledge. And I think that working remotely has actually really helped that. So interesting projects, one in Poland as a part of a cluster and one in Portugal, as well as another cluster, which we'll mention at the end of the session. So welcome to all our European partners. So in terms of the overall journey, I think it's really valid that Michael has identified that as part of the action plan, which we actually worked on with Michael and Maura and the team in Donegal County Council, as part of the local enterprise organisation, was we looked at where are the opportunities across the region. And one of the themes which Michael's then pulled out to say we want to action this is awareness. And that really is the start of a journey to say, right, if we understand and we're starting to get some ideas, then if we are able to identify then what we can do with what we have or how we can maybe do things differently, then this allows us to then start to, I call it chipping away. It starts to chip away at what is the opportunity? Can we pick it apart? Can we look at identifying the barriers and the opportunities and then the solutions, and then looking at how do we solve this so that we end up with basically a concept, which is how do we make things last? Now, that is the title of the policy document for circular economy in Scotland as part of the government policy document. And I think it's really interesting from the Irish perspective, living more, but using less. So it's the same kind of concepts around how can we be smarter with what we have? We've got a huge amount of capital, natural capital and manufactured capital. And we've got the social capital, which is the human beings in the middle, applying some thinking into it. So we're going to take you through this journey and start off with demystifying, like innovation and around circular economy, and then working through to some examples to apply it. So there may be parts of this which are very familiar to you, which is great. So some of this may be a reminder, but hopefully for other people, you're able to pick up some tips along the route, along the journey. So circular economy, like I mentioned in my opening gambit, sometimes it's something, a new term for something which is quite old. Anybody who's older than maybe the sort of 50 years old will think about times when things were not so available in terms of resources and in terms of economically as well, and would have really kind of, before really the kind of single-use theme really pushed in, single-use plastics, single-use packaging, etc. in the 1970s and 80s, very much a throwaway society. Anybody prior to that might have really kind of seen this concept of, we will darn our socks, we will make our clothes last longer, we will not waste because there's no spare, there's nothing spare. We're actually trying to use resources and materials really wisely and to make them last. We'll buy for quality rather than for discarding straight away. And that's a really simple way to explain around what circular economy is. How do we make things last? I've had senior directors in major construction companies throwing the pens down in workshops saying, Geraldine, what are you telling me? My grandmother darning my socks was actually circular economy. Yes, actually, that is an example of making things last. So in a really simple concept to apply it, but we're trying to think about, how do we think at the start of a process? How do we design out waste in the first instance? How do we design out pollution? If the design stage for a product or for a service will pretty much define what its environmental and sustainability carbon footprint even is through its whole life. You'll pretty much define that at design stage. So that is really key to really understand where's the influence in what we can actually do and deliver as a project. The second concept is to really kind of try to keep products and materials in use. And then the third part is to look at, how do we regenerate natural systems? So instead of causing destruction and pollution, how do we then reuse? How do we then enhance our environment as well? So everything from design and manufacture through to retailers, through to the consumer, really key. The consumers actually also drive this. Then looking at the reuse, repair, recycling economies. We've seen a resurgence of the trends towards like moving away from fast fashion, for example, and a lot of the Generation Z, part of the new consumers, are now saying we will shop in charity shops and we will look for the bargains, but also reuse, because we realise there's a huge impact from the textile sector, for example. It's the first or second most polluting industry in the whole world. But then we also look at the recycling sector also has a role to play, but it's not just all about how do we recycle. So it's thinking about, how do we valorize, how do we get value, real proper value out of materials which would have been waste if we think about it in a different way. So circular economy itself, you could think, well, is it like resource efficiency? So sometimes we get these different terms popping up, which are similar over a time period. Do you think, is it that? But circular economy is really going further than resource efficiency itself. Resource efficiency is really trying to say, how can we actually reduce waste? How can we reduce energy use? How can we reduce our dependency on certain materials? So there's similarities there, but circular economy is really looking at, how do we retain that value? How do we make things last for as long as possible, so that we're not wasting throughout that process? So interesting to sort of see, it's that kind of design stage. It's taking that whole life cycle into consideration, rather than we've got some waste, now what do we do with it? Okay, now we can send some for recycling, because that's quite low down the waste hierarchy. Now, the slide we've got up here around demystifying innovation, it's a very busy slide. There's lots of text on there. So really this push is towards saying, how can we change ourselves from being a linear economy, take, make, use, waste, boom, linear economy. How do we change that into being more cyclical? How do we actually reuse? How can we actually kind of maintain that value in life, in its lifetime? So increasing circularity, moving from linear up to circular economy. Sorry, my screen's over here, so I'm having to look. So it's really kind of saying, how do we move from literally the bottom of that, which is to get value out of a material, we can incinerate it and we can do energy recovery. Well, great, that's at least better than putting it a hole in the ground. But is it the best thing to actually do with that material? Is it the best way to think about the design of that material, that it does end up being incinerated? So pushing up through the hierarchy, how can we get through into the remanufacture, refurbishment, repair? And how do we actually get to the point where we're saying, we'll actually reuse a lot of the good materials that's there, and it just simply needs a small repair, and then we can enhance its lifetime and we can sell it again, which is the environmental meeting the economic. So obviously there's a lot of nuance that's within that, and especially we've got examples which are, for example, automotive and car parts, turbos, etc., being refurbished. There's a organisation in Scotland called Cummins Diesel, who actually do this, and they've had to go through a lot of hoops in terms of the certification for the safety of their products as well, to actually look at how do we reuse this. So they've identified a barrier. How do we reuse, repair, remanufacture, and then sell? So they're able to do that, retain value of the materials, and also sell it. And there's also an economic benefit there to customers. That's a great way to actually keep things in use. So moving all the way up into circular economy, it's like smarter product use, smarter manufacture. How can we rethink? How can we even refuse in terms of a strategy? How can we make a product redundant entirely by abandoning its function or by offering the same function with a radically different product? And an example I would use of that is how technology, that Michael alluded to at the start, how technology has been able to overleap the use of, for example, DVDs. So we don't really see DVD libraries anymore because the likes of streaming, the likes of using data, and of course you've got a shift. You've got more dependency on equipment, but you've also got service contracts for access to data and Wi-Fi, etc. But you've changed the materiality of what's going on. There's no longer stacks of plastics and manufacture of those materials to form DVDs, which are then ending up maybe used once and then sitting, taking up space, and then ending up in maybe recycling, but it's basically going to be wasted. So changing the way that we access things and the way that we access products and services can be a very interesting way and utilizing new technology can be a really interesting way to kind of look at how do we kind of make things last here. So just picked out a couple of examples from this. From the slide about thinking about how do we change something from being, actually we did always used to, that was just like a single use. How can we reuse? How can we be smarter? So in terms of the agri-food sector, which is where this seminar is really kind of focused on around agri-food, you think, well, circular economy, Michael said, there's a bit of slurry being spread locally. So there's a bit of the circular economy moving there, of course, reusing nutrients. So the ones which are very commonly thought about in terms of circular economy in food systems can be like from AD, anaerobic digestion, and things like composting, where you're reusing nutrients. All of these things have to be really properly managed to be able to get the best from the functions that they're doing. But then there's also things as you start to move up through the hierarchy, saying, can we buy local? Can we buy seasonal? How can we utilize those seasons? How do we reuse some co-products or wastes as other ingredients? There's so much out there just now in terms of trying to prevent and reduce food waste. It's an absolutely massive issue. I think if you take into account from the agricultural through to kind of food production and then to food waste, it again is in one of the top 3 of the actual greenhouse gas emitters globally, when we take into account those global markets. So these are really big issues, and these are things which we can address even in small ways to get to the point where we're essentially wasting less. So we do a lot of work actually around food waste reduction for hospitality and also manufacturing industry as well. And it is incredible the amount of money that's wasted because people are not really thinking smart about how you can really kind of take that holistic view and not waste. So in terms of demystifying innovation, we love a diagram. You may have heard of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation took these concepts and designed this diagram. It's called the butterfly diagram, is how it's referred to. And really this talks about the cycles in everything, and there's sometimes there's loops which fit within loops. But really, this is the right-hand side of this diagram is the manufactured environment, and the left-hand side is the biological environment. So the food products themselves would really sit on this left-hand side. Like, how do we look at, farming, collections, feedstock? How do we look at those biological materials? How do we use anaerobic digestion to extract biogas, which we can then use to then power? Obviously, this uses it in powering a dairy in Northern Ireland, for example. And some great opportunities to do things there which are smarter rather than allowing that to just escape into the atmosphere. And the right-hand side of the diagram actually talks about food production processes and also the wider supply chain. And actually working with partners is a very key thing in terms of circular economy as well. So you may think, okay, is it not recycling though, Geraldine? So it's like we think, let's see where recycling is in the actual diagram. So if you have a look, it's like saying it's here, we've found it. But what does this mean? It's on the outer edge. It's on the outer edge of what we're talking about here. And that's telling us that there's more value of the product the closer in to the user you can close the loops. There's more value there. So by the time you get to recycling, it's relatively low value. And so ideally, if we can look to say, how do we retain that value at its point of use? How do we maintain, repair, etc.? That is going to save us more money by being closer to having the loop closer to the user. So it's a kind of interesting way to think about, like, how do we get the best out of the products that we've got? I know that Mark de Foytje from the Uterus Council area, I know he's been doing a lot of work around the utilization of materials from, for example, fish processing. So fish itself, you'll get value from the meat, but then you'll also be able to get value from the bones from other parts of the fish, so that you're able to kind of actually make the best from what you have. You're able to extract nutrients, etc., which can then be sold for higher value. There's quite a technical side of that, of course, but that's all about partnerships and collaborations to make that work. So some food for thought there in terms of the butterfly diagram. Now, in terms of circular business models, there's three kind of different business models here. And I don't want to kind of bamboozle you, but at the same time, it's kind of useful to start thinking about, okay, where would that fit? And how is it best to kind of apply these? And some of these models kind of feed into each other, but these three really kind of sit on a upstream, use, and downstream. So upstream is like thinking about design, thinking about kind of where our materials are coming in. The circular use model is the use phase, like how can we make things last in the use phase? And then thinking about how do we then deal with an output from that use phase? And quite often the output can move its way back around to being an input to the innovation model. So there's a few examples that we've pulled in here. So it can be sustainable or circular procurement. So if we actually start to define what we want in our procurement, then we can really influence what people are thinking about, what companies are thinking about by way of what they want to sell us. And buying or defining processes or products actually reduce waste or can actually enhance because it's adding what we called here as circular ingredients. Now that could be nutrients, for example, from an agri-food perspective, but it also could be from the perspective of a percentage of recycled content, for example, in some packaging around food. So we've seen that with Marks and Spencer's, and they've actually been able to, they have to do the testing, obviously, to make sure that cross-contamination and that there's no leaching into the actual food substances as well, but it's all possible. And they now have a percentage recycled plastic content in their milk bottles and jugs and cartons. So in terms of circular use models, thinking about what we could apply, then there's reusable product packaging, which can arise. There's also the opportunities in reverse logistics. So being able to reuse the sort of space, because sometimes circular economy isn't just about a product. It's also about how we use what we have. And sometimes that is space, an empty part of a vehicle, for example. And it can also be about, this is really kind of important in terms of where the world is moving to, in terms of data, logistics, and IT, and how that digital side actually really supports sharing platforms, enabling to match up this need with this want. And it's like, how do we, this need with this offer. So to match up those things. So to enable that, it can be the simplest kind of thing, but difficult to achieve unless you actually have a way to make that work. And a kind of global example of this, which is maybe good, maybe bad, but is the example is Airbnb. So Airbnb being used to actually share spare space. So there's different arguments around Airbnb, but anyway, that's an example of how you can use that. And it's really disrupted the marketplace as well. So in terms of circular output models, thinking about how do we extract value from waste, how can we actually use returnable, transport packaging sort of downstream, how can we develop new products actually using what we would have thought of as being a waste, so transforming a waste into a valid raw material. And it's then starting to close that loop, saying, what do we have in Ireland? What do we have in Donegal? What do we have in Ireland, the island of Ireland, that we can actually use here, that we can valorize here instead of, we're importing, so to try and reduce sort of dependencies and to improve security of supply. Some really interesting things there. So connecting all of these things, we have partnerships and we have collaborations, because these things are not done alone. So in terms of looking at the kind of agri-food perspective, within the food sector, the circular economy can cover all different activities in the wider supply chain, from upstream activities through to primary production from farm, through to food production, manufactured food production as well. So the actual, treatment, washing, production of maybe meals, maybe other nutrients, and then through sale of product, and then down to all the downstream activities as well. For some companies, it's taking back secondary or tertiary packaging. For others, it's looking at how do we communicate with our consumers about what they can do with this. Can they compost this packaging, for example, in household compost as well? So to illustrate a few more examples, I'm just going to ask Alex to chip in, so you get a bit of different voice here. And Alex, take it away in terms of taking us through some examples, and then we'll look at some lessons learned.
So we tried to, there's so many examples to choose from, and it's sort of quite hard to get a good, it's quite hard to choose set examples, but we tried to sort of provide a breadth of different options across those models. One company that is quite local is Cellucomp to Scotland. So they developed a process. They're a science company, startup, and they developed a produce, basically a product that uses nanofibers from waste or wonky veg that a lot of producers or farms would sort of have to dispose of, typically sent to anaerobic digestion for incineration and or AD. But in this case, they're able to extract a specific fiber that would allow them to use it within either paint coatings, but also sort of 3D printing materials. So quite a high value added product. They were collaborating quite a few sort of universities and science hubs. And that is a good example of the sort of circular output model. So identifying a waste, identifying a way to extract a higher value product and sell that on. If they have, I think COVID has sort of impacted them quite a bit. So I think they're on hiatus at the moment, but they were very active until basically the start of the pandemic. That's a good example of a very high value added product. Next is the Clique. So this is a company based in the Netherlands, and they're in Utrecht, and they basically bridge the gap between to become the middle person to provide that sort of support between businesses who have waste, organic waste, and entrepreneurs or startups or companies who need raw materials. And they provided that logistics solution within the city. So identifying types of waste that they could collect and work in partnerships with the companies or the hospitality venues, and then collect all this waste and then deliver it or provide it, keep it within a hub that would allow other partners or startups to sort of use these waste. So the example given in the slide here is they partnered with lots of the hospitality businesses to collect orange peels and then transported that to another company that would then extract different elements from the orange peels for flavoring, for sort of essential oils. Another waste stream they had was coffees, which is very topical, and there's a lot of projects with coffee waste. But they were then collecting that and providing that to a company that would use that as a growing medium for mushrooms, that would then sell the mushrooms onto the local hospitality sector, but also to other companies for mycelium, for extracting different elements from the mushrooms. So they became really the middle persons. They didn't actually provide the solution itself, but they provided that logistics solution that allowed for partnerships and collaborations. QA Fish, the company we worked with several years ago, and they're based in Shetland, so quite a remote location. And they are a seafood processor, and one of their key products are scallops. And through a partnership with several universities and research centers, as well as a manufacturing company, they developed a process to extract lime from the scallop shells and to use that really as a natural fertilizer. This really allowed them to divert several hundreds or several thousand tons of shells from the disposal route, which allowed them to have quite significant savings. But the key part was really to reduce the need of shipping of fertilizers from the UK mainland and from Europe. So the sort of overall carbon savings within the supply chain and the wider impact was quite significant. And finally, one example that is quite local to Donegal, but is a good example to show that circular economy solutions don't have to be these wide-ranging solutions or these high-value sort of science-heavy, I guess, products or processes. Glenboring Farm Produce, during the lockdown, they did set up basically an egg vending machine, and it seems very very straightforward and simple, but for them it had a big impact. So not only did they reduce quite a lot of packaging from sort of both for purchase and from waste at sort of consumer level, all the consumers who went to the vending machine would just use their own containers, but then the trays that were used within the machine could be reused by the farm and simply refilled. So it had a big impact, both economically, but also environmentally around the supply chain, both for them purchasing packaging, but also the customer having to dispose of packaging.
That's really good, Alex. It's really good to kind of sort of see the range of different sorts of solutions, actually, and the different sorts of examples. So we thought it would be useful to pull in a section which actually looks at some of the challenges and some of the lessons learned, and then how to kind of get started, really, and some of our tips from what we've learned from the circular economy work that we have done as well. And in terms of just introducing this, it really is a challenge to think differently. It's a challenge for businesses which are just thinking, okay, what can I make? What can I sell? And if we always do what we always did, we'll always get what we always got. And it's a very kind of well-worn phrase, but we do have to think differently sometimes about how we can change what we do and some of the established norms that's there, because we are seeing environmental impacts, we are seeing consumer impacts, we are seeing consumer pressure of people setting up companies which you never would have thought would have been successful, like even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and now this forms the basis of their business model. An example I would use is actually Rico, who manufacture and remanufacture the actual photocopying and scanning machines, which are sold business to business, and they're actually sold on service agreements. And Rico maintain all of the actual plastic, all of the ABS plastics, etc., all of the materials that's actually within that. they have a material passport. So they know exactly what each unit is made of. They know how much exact material they've got access to in terms of what's in there, what's been produced and what's out in the marketplace. And then they know when the lifetime of those particular units is expended, those units will come back to them and then they'll be remanufactured. So they know exactly what the materials is actually in their supply chain at whichever times. So this is how the whole of their business now is set up on this circular economy model. And we've given you different examples as well. So there are ways of doing it. So really, it can be a chance for you, maybe after this presentation, and thinking about what do we have access to? How are we selling that? And just challenging each thought process to say, how can you think about this in a circular way? Is there a route there? And is there a route there which actually makes things last? It enables us to live more, it enables us to use less, but we're still in business. So it's very important to balance the kind of economics with the actual project itself, the service or the product that's been looked at for circular economy. And there will be a lot of ideas pulled together to then define, well, which one is the best or which are the best, and there may be more than one, which you take forwards into saying, we're going to take these top three and let's explore those a little bit further. So in terms of the challenges to implementing circular business models, what we have come across is there's this thought that maybe we need to change the entire existing business model, and we need to do that all at once. So that's not necessarily true, of course. So we'll have a look at some of these other challenges in a second. I'll pass you back to Alex. Not communicating with the wider supply chain, that can be a really big barrier, because you really do have to be talking upstream and downstream to see what can we actually do together. And there are some other challenges tied up with that as well. And then part of this can be to do with want to kind of keep it close to us. So if I can't do it all in-house, then there's kind of no point to it. So sometimes people think I need to control everything, and I'm reluctant to use external parties. So if I can't do it all in-house, then there's kind of no point to it. But the kind of premise behind circular economy is great. If you can do it all in-house, brilliant. But as Alex has talked about some of the examples, some of them are really kind of science heavy. It can be different processes, etc., which are not your core business. So the collaboration and partnership piece is really key to kind of work out who are the best people to work with and how can I kind of overcome this challenge where we both win and we deliver something. So, I mean, some of the very typical challenges, there's no surprises in here, I'm sure. Funding can be a really major one to sort of make any big business change. It's generally about like, okay, where do we get the funding from? How can we build a business model that makes sense? It can be time. We've got great ideas, but we just don't have any time to follow them up. How many people have sat in the pub and came up with the best ideas in the world, but it was 20 years ago, and it's like somebody else has managed to get them to market. So it's like, but they've got a big team, they've got resources they can use. So time it can be an enemy, but it can also be a friend. If you've got a need that's kind of quite immediate, it can help you to kind of overcome. It can help you to overcome that challenge of dragging our feet and to not get something to market. Accessibility to the product and market acceptance can be another major challenge. So looking at kind of how can we identify what's going to be a barrier, and then how do we overcome that? I mentioned Cummins diesel. They couldn't sell a car part without having a BSI certification on it. So it's like saying it needs to be automotive certified, that it's applicable and the quality of that product is acceptable. So you're not going to void insurances and things like this. So the market acceptance can be a really interesting part of not just the quality of what you're offering, but also what the market's looking for. It can be an opportunity. These things are not, you take a barrier, but turn it into an opportunity as well. And we do a lot of market research and kind of actually kind of reaching out to see, what sorts of things, what sort of price points, where are the issues, where are the challenges, and how will, whether it's business to business or business to consumer, where is the need there, and what would hold somebody back from purchasing that product or that service in terms of circular. And you'll sometimes uncover some really good nuggets of information in there, and also find the specific markets which are of interest. Like, for example, clothing reuse and clothing hiring, etc., these sorts of models. Who's going to be most interested in that? Anybody with a young family growing up realizes that the children's clothes last about 2 months and then they've grown out of them. So there's been some really good models that we've worked on, which actually look at how do you kind of enable that economy to be able to make it into a sharing economy, but where you actually kind of rent access to clothing rather than having to purchase it, use it, and then discard it. So there's been some big successes, I think, UK-wide. And anybody who watches Dragon's Den will have seen there was an example of somebody who got a lot of backing to be able to set up these business models. So the final one here is about compliance. And I mentioned about quality in terms of compliance, but it can also be to do with end of waste criteria and making sure that you are not going over some of the limits in terms of where is a product a waste and when does it become a raw material. So like a product that's being discarded would be classified as waste, but you say, well, but actually we're going to use it as raw material and we will valorize it. So you've got to very much check to see about the regulatory standpoint to make sure you're not going to fall foul of the Environment Agency and the waste management regulations. So, but there are ways, and the agencies are looking proactively actually to work with businesses on this, because they recognize that it can be a barrier. So how do we overcome it? So there are different challenges that's actually out there. And in terms of, getting started, you may be looking at a circular economy business model as an entirely new business model, but it could be sort of diversification from what you do into like additional business models. It could be looking at acquiring like new ways of doing things and actually transforming potentially from one business model to another over time, to actually say we will transform 100%, but we want to trial it first. We want to have a pilot and see how we can actually do this. When we actually assess what is the market, how can I overcome some of the quality issues? How can I overcome the technological issues, and also the data, the collaboration and sharing issues? So, I mean, there can be massive opportunities thinking about upstream and downstream suppliers. There can be others who also think the same way, but you've just never actually put two and two together to see, can we be bigger and better if we do it ourselves? So, Alex, just in terms of other projects and just in terms of lessons learned and how to get started, maybe you can take us through some of the points here and also some of the lessons learned.
Yeah, so this is sort of, I guess, lessons from a lot of the sort of circular economy business support we've been involved with in Scotland. So providing consultancy support to companies who have a circular idea or certain model they want to implement, and helping them through that, I guess, that journey at various stages. So some are already at stage 0, which is we want to know what is possible, to sort of really ready to market. We want to just do the final test to make sure that this is actually ready for sort of launch. And the main thing that seems to come out, and particularly within the agri-food sector, is it's really important to understand your whole supply chain and the inputs, your processes, your outputs. And that may seem like something that you may already know, but actually mapping it out and clearly sort of having that visualization of the landscape is really important to sort of identify where potential options might be. And that is because very often there is a focus on the actual product or on the actual waste, and that's it. And so if there isn't a potential circular solution for the product, then it's often forgotten or abandoned or seen as, well, you can't be circular. But as Geraldine mentioned, it's the whole supply chain, but also the whole production processes. So it means that maybe the product, there is no current available option to extract waste or to reuse or to make the specific product circular. But you still have facilities, you still have equipment to manufacture that product, you still have transport to deliver that product. So the whole activities around the product itself that can be turned circular. And it's really understanding what you can control, what you can influence, and where, if you don't control, if you don't have any kind of specific opportunity to do it yourself, then that's where those collaborations and conversations can come in. And once you have that map out, sorry, Geraldine, could you just go back to the...
Yep.
Once that's mapped out, that's when you can start thinking of, okay, can I challenge the business as usual? What in an ideal world would I want to do? Could we order this packaging or this machinery from more locally? Could we have that repaired? Could that be, could we reuse heat in a specific way that would allow us to sort of reduce our energy consumption? So there's different ways to look at it. And then of course, can the conversation supply chain happen? Do we have any skills in-house that can help develop these ideas? And then slowly refining based on what is available, what the conversations sort of bring out. And then refining into ideas that then start to look like potential models or potential sort of solutions. So the key part is really not being afraid to start small. And I think that was the highlight with the egg sort of vending machine, is really very often starting small is a good step. The company we worked with was McLean's Highland Bakery. And so they had a pretty straightforward idea, is partnership with a brewery and to reuse the spent grains within their production process to turn it into a food product. So previously the grains would have gone to cattle feed, which is still good, still circular, but they managed to turn it into higher value product for human consumption. More importantly, they were using sort of residual heat from their own ovens to then dry the grains to make it more efficient and sort of not have to, I guess, to keep the sort of footprint a lot lower. So that was a small range within their overall product range, but it was the start of something, and then it led to additional conversations. Jaw Brew are a beer company based in Glasgow, and similarly, they're not doing anything particularly innovative, but they work with a bakery, a local bakery, to then, when this bakery has waste breads or unsold breads, they deliver that to the brewery, and the brewery makes a specific range of beer using the bread as input. This has been done before and in lots of countries, but it's, again, it doesn't have to be wildly innovative. And like Jolene said, a lot of the things are just coming back to what we used to do before. And more recently, we're working with a ready meal company who want to introduce a sort of returnable container. And they have 150 meals on option at the moment, and they're slowly just starting with maybe 3 family-sized meals, slowly building that up, and then they can expand. So really starting small, allowing that sort of trial, see what the response is often really key. The other thing is very often ideas maybe don't work, unfortunately, and there's a refining and iteration. It's an iterative process. Xanthella was a company worked with through the circular economy support program, and they had a process to capture CO2 from distillery and brewery fermentation to grow microalgae for then further sort of high value products. The trial test and the research basically showed that it was not feasible at a specific scale, and particularly not in Scotland, mainly due to the lack of sunlight, which is quite important. But they then sort of went away and are sort of working on a sort of new sort of system. Similarly, Packaging Solutions Scotland developed a returnable container for seafood processing, specifically for that industry. And initially, the container was not as effective. The different components would have to be disposed of at different rates. And through sort of reworking the design, they slowly now managed to develop a container that is sturdy, that can be reused a large number of times, but more importantly, that can be recycled entirely in Scotland. So to make it, to sort of bring back the loop as local as possible. And then one other example was working within a specific agri-food with a dairy company who wanted to develop try to find ways to reuse whey and look at products out of that. But again, that was not, through trial and error, it was not feasible at this stage. But then several years later, one of the partners we had worked with during that project went back to them with a new product idea, and now they're working on developing something there. So initial ideas may not be feasible or may not be realistic at a specific stage, but that sort of step is really important to identify what is possible, what might be possible at a later stage, or what might need sort of additional partners.
I think those are really good examples just to sort of show the different sorts of stories that can be around the journey towards circular, and also that it creates a network of collaboration, and we start to look at opportunities together. And I think that's a great example, Alex, that you finished with, like looking at the waste whey. It's like the big issue that always comes out of dairies. What do we do with the whey? And to be able to valorize that, you tend to have this big challenge, which is to do with scale. And so it's anybody who's like micro or sort of small, medium-sized enterprise may find that the scale that's needed to make the books balance, like in terms of economics, but also the environmental side and the time it takes to kind of develop things, then the scale can be a real limiting factor. But with collaboration with other partners, then there can be other solutions which can then be found by working together. So it does help. I would say, we're not just saying this because we're consultants, but consultancy support can be invaluable, and I would recommend and say, it doesn't have to be massive projects. You can actually use consultancy support in stages to actually, the benefit is to be able to get the experience of all the different projects and the different kinds of mechanisms that's been used previously, and to connect people, because it can be someone talks to us about one issue and you say, oh, actually, you should talk to these other two people. You guys should talk because there could be a potential partnership there, or at least some knowledge sharing. And, those are really valuable things. We get these comments so many times. It's like the support has actually helped us to accelerate what we're doing, or it's helped us to really fine tune what we're doing. And we actually were going perhaps in a direction that we didn't realize. We were so passionate about it. We became blinded to the fact that there wasn't an economic solution for this, or it might be on like an 8 or 9 year payback. So when we're able to bring in as a third party who's independent from that process to challenge as a friend, but to challenge effectively, to really kind of help companies and organizations, startups, third sector, you name it, we've worked with it, to kind of challenge and kind of fine tune and improve like their idea, and to identify the barriers, but then to also come up with, well, what sorts of solutions are out there, and is this the right time to be entering this marketplace, or is it like not yet, or then a few years later the project can come back like Alex just described. So it is really kind of balancing the risk, because especially for small, medium-sized enterprises, any enterprise, it's investment. You're thinking about, well, what am I going to get for this? So it's how do we balance those two sides, but also being aware of the risks that there are to companies if you do nothing. And that's a really important message. And the story I often use for this is, if you were a plastic straw manufacturer, then you'd be thinking, this is a big risk to my business if single-use plastics are then being banned and my market is going to shrink from being 100% to being 2%. What do I do to address that? And I think we need to use that as an example to think about, what are we doing in our business right now that we are wasting, or that we are not preparing for a risk which is coming? So how can we use that as an opportunity to actually think differently about our business and position for the future? And the future may actually be in 6 months' time, not as in like 2030 and far down the line. So really interesting. And out of the cluster collaboration platform that we were working on in Europe last summer, just finished up just before Christmas, the 2 projects in Poland and Portugal that we mentioned. This is a great example of how even people in the same area geographically, or who kind of probably should have known each other and known what was going on, they didn't. And until we actually held a collaborative workshop online, then there was a great finding from it, which 2 people realized, I've got this waste stream and you've got that need. So it's like, right, we put these things together then. So it's like, now you've got a close to home supply chain, and you've got an opportunity there to collaborate. And instead of you shipping some material in from very far away, all of the environmental impact, but also the time impact and the sort of on the resource security side. So really great examples came out of the clusters. So the Polish cluster was around renewable energies and manufacturing. And the Poland cluster was all focused on, it was life cycle assessment and construction materials and embodied carbon, and thinking about circular principles within construction industry as well. So some really kind of varied, and in fact, the Polish cluster actually had a crossover with Agrifood, on the AD side, and actually reuse of materials and looking at how do we do something smarter around kind of fertilizer bags and things like this as well. So there are really kind of varied opportunities even within these clusters, which are focused around like a sector. So that was really good. So in terms of what to do around next steps, and we're just coming to a close of like what we're going to be talking about, and we'll open up the floor for any questions or discussion points. So I'll ask Maura to keep an eye on the Q&A and see if there's anything coming in from the listeners. And I'm aware that we have delegates from around Europe, so we've tried to speak a little slower, so hopefully you've picked up the messaging. And next steps is really the first call to action is, can we think differently about our business? What is it that we're offering? Are we offering it as a product that we could change it to being a service? We could then have money coming in on service models. So it's like a renewal, a subscription, a monthly fee, but then we're taking on that material, we're taking on that product, and we also take ownership of it through its whole life cycle. And that maybe gives us new opportunities to make things last and to live more, but use less, which is just really kind of in line with the Irish Environment Agency and the government policy around circular economy. So how can we use the principles and the ideas? Maybe you've got one or two ideas from what we've talked about today. How can we kind of avoid, take, make, dispose? How can we get away from the linear? How can we enhance kind of value of anything which we'd consider to be waste? Great thing that I do going around organisations, companies, you say, I do get teased a bit from the engineers for this sort of activity, but you go and if you have a look in the skips and see what waste has actually been thrown out. And if you look into a skip, you say, well, someone's bought all this. Someone's bought all this waste. So when you start to think about waste as having value, but also how do we add value to it, it can really change your perception about how instead of thinking it's somebody else's problem now, we can bring it in to say, how can we make this an opportunity? And the future towards net zero emissions, towards all these things, I know that there's quite a lot of contention around maybe composting and like net zero and some of the kind of reuse models. But you do have to be careful about looking at carbon footprints, of taking the life cycle assessment into account, but thinking, how do we look for the opportunity? The opportunities and the solutions is what business is great at. Governments and organisations, big scale national organisations, they can move slowly, they can provide a framework, but the ones who are going to move faster, they're going to be the businesses and the enterprises. Because if you've got an entrepreneur driving something, they're going to make it happen if it's going to actually be economically viable. So, but do make sure you've got the right partners involved. Like, think about any key partners, especially in your supply chain, and also think about where there's other support that you can access. And I think Michael's Maura is going to just bookend this presentation with just a quick word about what is available locally. So think about Lean and Green. The Lean and Green business support in the Republic of Ireland. Mabbit are one of the listed companies on the Lean and Green directory. If you want to reach out to us via that mechanism, you're very welcome to do so. There's other companies listed as well. And also the local enterprise office, who've been, first class in stepping forwards and saying, we want to use this, the Sinsay project and Interreg to kind of actually drive something for our region. It's the northwest of Ireland in terms of Donegal, but very much can be very leadership focused in what you're actually doing, which is fantastic, and using those examples nationally as like, these are good case studies. So I think it's just keep it real and try to think differently. I think around the product services that you've got, think it forward, think, okay, and what are my competitors doing? And sometimes we've seen competitors actually working together to be able to create something bigger or something which is actually able to overcome more barriers. So interesting times. So the kind of call to action, I suppose, is to think, but then to get some help, get some support, maybe at the start, if you're at that starting phase, like Alex said, there's everything from like getting an idea, ideation sessions and feasibility, all the way through to kind of actually market test and launch. That's the kind of support sort of portions that we actually offer and work on. So really interesting. And I'm going to just open the floor to Maura to see about any questions.
Yeah, am I on? Yeah, thank you both.
Oh, sorry, Michael.
Yeah, no, to myself, Charlie. Just a few questions have come in that I have just made a wee note here. I think, Alec, you touched on it, but there's a question there around this perception that a lot of this is investment heavy. So a lot of investment required and a question mark about the return. And you were saying maybe one of the challenges there might have been around something like that. So just I suppose from your experience, from both of you, is that a challenge? Does it really involve a lot of investment? A lot of this stuff, the circular projects, or?
It can do. Just to chip in first, it can do. The key thing is to make the books balance between like what's your pilot or your trial, and like what can you demonstrate in terms of what you're likely to get in terms of value for a waste stream. So to come at that with a business plan, like you would for anything, like in any business, you'd have a business plan around it. So it's like looking at, okay, what's going to be the cost? What's going to be the return? What are we willing to invest in? Are there any grant support as well out there? And there sometimes can be. Different regions in Europe have got different access to all sorts of different grant schemes. But then also looking at your finance institutions and like where there's maybe green investment funds who are willing to back you for a project that's going to pay back over a longer time period than perhaps a traditional 3-year payback. It might be an 8 or 9 year payback, but then be really kind of worthwhile. So if you can find the right kind of support mechanisms, but all of those support mechanisms, by the time you get into an investment point, they're going to want to see that you've identified your business plan, you've taken into account your risks, your barriers, and you've really seriously kind of addressed that. We consistently get really good feedback on the kind of like risk registers that we help companies with. And it really kind of shows an investor that you're serious and that it's not just like you've been got in blinkered, to really just focus on the one area because you've got a pet project or something. It really is kind of like taking, we use the business model canvas, the innovation canvas to actually deliver on that. So it can be a barrier, but if you've proven what it is that you're doing in terms of pilots, trials, market research, and identified that, then it just reduces those risks as much as possible.
The thing as well, if I can chip in quickly on that, is quite a lot of the support we've given is actually work on business case and business models. And especially for the agri-food and bioeconomy, there is a lot of trialing, and that can be the really sort of tricky part, especially at the sort of startup stage. One thing that has worked really well for the companies we've worked with has been partnerships with universities and with higher education institutes, because there is very often they have the capacity and the time and the sort of availability to undertake a lot of these testings and these sort of maybe more pilot studies, and very often are quite happy to engage in those as well. So I guess that's where the sort of talk of collaboration, partnership, and getting the word out and understanding, I guess the sort of investment stage is really hard if you're trying to do everything yourself. That is definitely a big stumbling block. And if there is any way to sort of mitigate that by partnering with universities who can help you to sort of trial or pilot studies, for example, to help build that business case, those have worked really well for the projects we've worked on.
So just if we follow on my own thought process, so is the circular economy more appropriate or easier for an existing food business as opposed to somebody starting out with an idea in the circular economy? To me, it would make more sense if I'm an existing business. I'm just thinking, if I was an existing food business and I want to bring in either a practice that reduces this, or as another product here, I take my waste and do this with it, or reduce my use of water, or you bring in a circular economy practice as opposed to developing a circular economy product.
You may not have
Seems to me that might be easier and less expensive.
It may be, but you may not have those skills. So then it becomes expensive to develop those skills in-house. So then that's where the balance comes in, I'd say. So you might have an idea, not really know how to implement it or not have the skills to develop that. And that's where maybe partnership with an entrepreneur or startup may provide those skills or those solutions. And then that's when you can build maybe a model together. And there's quite a few projects that have looked like that.
Yeah, Charlie?
Michael, I think that it's what Alex has said is spot on, and I think that sometimes you've seen that there's an opportunity, whether it's an existing business, but they actually don't want to take on the risk, but there's maybe a third party who wants to set that up as a business to then collaborate with them. So, I mean, a sort of the example that's popping into my head is the blowing of plastic plastic cartons to be used in a dairy industry, for filling with milk. But then it's like they've worked out, actually, if we've got a hole in the wall into our dairy and the bottles are being manufactured on one side and sent straight through the hole in the wall, but the dairy doesn't own the packaging part of the business. It's a collaboration, a partnership. They're working geographically extremely close together, but trying to look at closed loop about getting material back, etc. The dairy is producing dairy products. They're not a packaging company, but if they work with a packaging company to look at circular models, then they've got the, like Alex is saying, the skills. They've got the kind of all of the supply chain sorted out. So there's a potential collaboration there between them. So there's not just, I don't think there's just one solution. To what you're asking about. Is it easier? We hate using the phrase, but it's so true. It depends. It depends on the skills, etc., that's there and the investment. But being open, I think, to kind of like being honest with yourselves about like what is within your kind of your remit and what could be best if it was kind of like if you could persuade another entrepreneur to kind of work with you or somebody who's working as a specialist in those areas. So hopefully that illustrates a bit more around to your point.
Okay, another question, not related really at all. Is there any online website or repository that gives a lot of information around circular economy or good practices or case studies in Europe or UK or Ireland that you know of?
There's quite a few different ones. I would signpost people to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as well.
Right, yeah. Have you ever?
So yeah, we can signpost that one. Zero Waste Scotland we do a lot of work with, and they've got case studies, etc., which is published. Some of them are quite brief. That's maybe one of the comments. Michael?
Yeah, okay. The last one I see in here, and again, I think it was touched on by one or other of you there. The issue about, I suppose, I think one of the challenges was market acceptance, but they need to develop a revenue model. I think, we have assisted one or two businesses here in Donegal in the last 10 years that were using, it was recycled product or product that was discarded to make other products, but they didn't last because one, I think there wasn't enough where we worked on them. Well, probably there wasn't a critical mass in the market, but the revenue model was also an issue. So I'm just wondering a minute, do you need a different approach for the revenue model I think the question was, do you need a different approach around a revenue model for the circular economy than you would, let's say, for an ordinary sort of going to market with an ordinary product? Or does it depend as well, depending on what the kind of service or product you're doing? I mean, I'm thinking of that, the Dutch case study, whenever I saw the question, I was wondering, do they have a fee income when they collect and a fee income when they sell?
Yeah, so then it's sort of looking at what is already in place. So any food business or business will pay a waste uplift fee. So they simply transfer that to the waste contractor that was typically used, and they collect that fee. That specific example, they also have a hub where they collect all the waste that are not given directly to specific partners, but then that hub is like a trial hub. So people and universities and startups can come and basically experiment and test and different elements using that space. So it's sort of using a more traditional, I guess, revenue stream, but then thinking of how you can expand that to something a bit different. So for example, they've expanded that to, rent a sort of pilot area or pilot space, while also having the sort of more traditional income stream of waste management. So it's sort of thinking of either using one or how can some be combined in some cases.
Okay. Vincent, you had a particular question, Vincent Farley. So Vincent, I think that's more appropriate probably we forward your request onto Eileen in the Enterprise Europe Network. I think if you're looking for European partners, that's probably a better platform than this. A wee question myself, and it's more around not-for-profit models. Do they work? I mean, can they work after subvention stops? Or have you any experience of sort of not-for-profits in the circular economy? I know that in our European project, there was a couple of not-for-profit case studies, but the real challenge was when the subvention or the public funding stopped, it was difficult to make them commercially viable and sustainable.
It's a really interesting point, and there's probably a whole raft of different reasons why the certain projects have stopped. We've got a great example that we did work with actually in Scotland, and it's called a company called Glasgow Wood Recycling, and they have been, like, you would think that they would be quite focused on like looking for grants, etc. They're part of the Revolve network, which is a national network for recycled products, and they reuse a huge amount of the waste tread boards from scaffolding. So it's like scaffolding boards. And they use a sort of social, it's like a social enterprise basically, but it's a company that stands on its own feet. So that is kind of, it came out of an idea, which was kind of around kind of, you know, third sector, but it has actually jumped through to, it's a company. It's a, you know, a company in its own right. So there are ways to make it successful. The workforce that they use is giving skills to people who've been traditionally long-term unemployed and have got mental health problems as well. So it's a really great story about what they do, and they've made it really successful. It's not to say that they'll be massively profitable, but it's it's a successful and sustained, and it came out of that idea of like a third sector organisation.
And that's where,
Alex?
if I can jump in as well, is where the combination of revenue streams and models, it works really well, specifically for social enterprises. So quite a few recent business models we've been trying to develop has been for social enterprises who started with a specific idea and we want to focus on this. This is our solution. It's circular. But like you say, it can't really work without funding because that specific revenue stream isn't sufficient, or the scale will need time to grow. But then it's how can that be combined with maybe more traditional or non-traditional revenue streams. So for example, in this case, it was they can partner with sustainable, they can provide a sort of a sales platform for sustainable products and provide workshops that give them a baseline revenue stream, but then also gives them the sort of financial ability to then focus on the more specific circular project they really wanted to start with. And again, that the Clique example is a good example of that. So they have this wider sort of research testing hub that then allows them to also do the sort of more practical circular options.
Yeah. Maura, has any other questions? No? Okay, I think we're okay on the questions. So as Geraldine said, I'm going to just touch on a few of the supports available, and my apologies to any of international people who are logged in. This is really for the Irish audience. So just a brief run through some of the supports currently available that would be applicable, I think, to the circular economy. One is the Green for Micro. It's a program run through the local enterprise offices where a micro enterprise can get up to 2 days consultancy. And it's really about that, as Alec was talking about scoping out what maybe the idea would be, and also an audit in there in your business. A second one would be Lean for Micro, which really is touching on, as Geraldine talked about there, the efficiency. So it's looking at your practices within your business, whether that's on the amount of material you have in storage, what your processing like, what your use of energy is like, whatever else. So Lean is looking at those, and then ideally focusing in on a project that you want to take and address, and you can get more than one Lean, and it covers, I think, 5 days consultancy at 100% as well. There is also one, I think, related to it. It's about tying in with the process, and that's a new one coming through called Digital for Micro. So it's again, if you're looking at some of your process and you want to apply software or digitalize some of your practices, again, it's reducing some of your carbon footprint. So it's linking in the green, the digital, the carbon, the sustainability, all. Again, it's 4 days consultancy. But then a fundamental one, I think, again, Alec was talking about there, and we was talking about the ideas. If you want to look, if you have an idea around the circular economy, I would call it the bog standard support of a feasibility study is there and could be used for that, to look at just how commercially viable is this, or one, is it viable, commercially viable, and then also, is it technically viable to do this? So it can look at any of those areas. It covers in the western and border regions, it's 60% funding, and the rest of the country, it's 50% funding. So that feasibility study is there. So those are 4 supports that are available through the local enterprise office. Again, if you're a larger company and you're in this space, I would recommend you go and talk to Enterprise Ireland. And if you're in the Gaeltacht area, you talk to Udris and the Gaeltacht. They would have a similar suite, not the same, but very similar. Enterprise Ireland would have, and from those 4 products that the local enterprise office have as well. And is there any other cash coming in there, Maura, or there's just a bit of discussion I see coming in? No, it's just websites and stuff. All right. Okay. So I know we're a little bit ahead of time, folks. I think that's it. I think, Maura, this is going to be made available online, is it? So this will be, the session will be up on our YouTube channel of Donegal Local Enterprise Office. So for anybody logging in, that's localenterpriseoffice.ie/Donegal for our website. I'd just like to thank Geraldine and Alec for today, but also for their work with us on developing our own action plan. Maura and I have learned a lot from them. Started off with fairly limited understanding of the circular economy 2 years ago, and it's still fairly limited, but it is developing. So thank you very much, and thank you all for tuning in, and thank to Stephen here, our technical man, who has kept us going for the last hour and a half. So thank you all very much. And if you're local, or if you're even in another county, don't forget there are other events this week in Local Enterprise Office in your area. So log in to localenterpriseoffice.ie and have a look-see. Thank you very much and good evening. Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alec, okay.
Thank you. Thanks a million. Bye-bye.